Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Asia Future Summit. I hope you had a good lunch. In this session, we will be looking at US-China cooperation in an age of strategic competition. I'm Yian Ping, the editor of ThinkChina. ThinkChina.sg is an SPH English language e-magazine with a focus on China and supported by the Chinese language newspaper Lianhe Zaobao. But let me introduce the topic. We all know that the US-China relationship is one of the most, if not the most impactful and influential relationship between two countries in the world. While the two countries are very different in terms of governance, ideology, cultural makeup, and history, it is in the interest of both countries and for the whole world, including all of us here, to find a way forward together that will allow cooperation, some competition perhaps, and also some degree of maybe even conflict and confrontation without leading to war. So I think that's why we are here today, to find the way forward. Now, let me introduce the panel. With me on stage are Professor Wang Jiangyu. Professor Wang is a professor at the City University of Hong Kong School of Law and the director of the Center for Chinese and Comparative Law. He was also with the Faculty of Law, National University of Singapore, for more than a decade, where he served as the director of the Asian Law Institute and was the founding deputy director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies. And we have Professor Orville Schell, the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on US-China Relations at Asia Society in New York. He's a longtime China observer, author, journalist, and former dean and professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And he remains on UC Berkeley faculty as Professor Emeritus. And next to me, we have Professor Zhu Feng. He's the Dean of the School of International Studies of Nanjing University and the Executive Director at the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea. He was formerly Deputy President of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies and a professor at the School of International Studies at Peking University. Thank you, our panelists, for joining us from all around the world. Well, as many of us would agree, China-US tension has worsened over the years, and each country sees the other as the source of the problem. And each is also looking outside of the other to form cliques and alliances. Some say we are heading towards real and comprehensive decoupling, even when both economies are still very much intertwined. My question is, how did we get to where we are now? And what are the chances of cooperation, and where are they? Well, our panel will be sharing their opinion on the topic, and after that, we will move on to the Q&A session. May we start with Professor Orville, please?
Thank you. It's really nice to be here in Singapore and to celebrate your founding leader's 100th birthday. And I think in a certain sense you can say that Singapore represents that the best moment in US-China or China-world relations when there still was the promise that countries didn't have to choose sides, which is of course still Singapore's challenge. I thought it was really interesting this morning, wonderful sessions. But unless I was mistaken, I did not hear the name of Xi Jinping mentioned once. That surprises me, because I think he is a man who has written himself very large and is critical to our understanding of what is happening and what might happen. That said, the question that is really very much on my mind, and I'm very interested to hear my colleagues' reactions and responses, is this. And you alluded to it in a certain sense at your introduction. Why did engagement end? It was an extraordinary period of decades that was initiated, as you all remember, in 1971, 72, when Kissinger and Nixon met with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. And they didn't know what they were setting in motion. But they were setting in motion this whole era of engagement. And that era really took off when, of course, Deng Xiaoping came back into power in 1978, the very end, 79, and then in the 80s, and initiated his period of reform and opening. And the supposition, I think, that everybody sort of adopted was we could get together. Things were changing. We wouldn't turn into carbon copies of each other, but we could get along. We had different political systems, okay. We can trade, we can have cultural relations, we can have academic interactions, civil society interactions. And that initiated a period which many of you have experienced, which was one of the most extraordinary periods of my life, the 1980s. And China sort of did come alive. In fact, a British diplomat wrote a wonderful book about the early 80s, late 70s. It's called Coming Alive. And it was a period of immense hope and immense optimism. I think that any of us who lived through it experienced it and shared. And then, of course, came 1989 and the Beijing massacre. And that was an immensely tragic moment. And many of us thought, well, all right, this is the end of that halcyon, very promising period of togetherness. But it turned out that it wasn't that simple. Jiang Zemin, who many of us at the time looked at as being somewhat a little clownish, to be frank, when you look back on him, you have to say he was quite an extraordinary leader. Deng Xiaoping was still around for a while, and kept things going, and reform didn't completely die. The Americans and China did get back together again in some rudimentary form. And I've been on many, many presidential trips and watched different leaders interact. And I have to say, on that trip, that when Clinton went to China in 1998, it was a very extraordinary interaction between these two leaders, because you could see through their body language, through their facial expressions, that they enjoyed each other's company. And this press conference, I don't know if any of you were there, when we were at the Great Hall of the People, and as we were walking into the press conference, it was announced, stunning announcement, that the press conference would be broadcast live over Chinese radio and television all across the country. And there was a freewheeling press question session. And we went into the room where Clinton and Jiang Zemin were to hold forth, and it was an extraordinary time. These two men were laughing. They were sort of enjoying interacting with each other in a very sort of friendly and open way. And that was after 1989. Incredible. And then we forged along thinking history had a motion. Do you remember that moment? I think many of us felt history was heading in a direction of greater openness. China wasn't going to become America, and America wasn't going to become China, but it was okay. And then we ended up with Hu Jintao, who was a kind of an unclear in concept leader. Not like Hu Yaobang, who was incredibly open and lively and unpredictable, and then Zhao Ziyang, as you all know what happened to him. And it was all right, though. Things forged along, and President Biden went to China. It wasn't the greatest trip the president's ever been on, but said, you know, we don't view China's rise as a threat to the national interest of America. And then we come to Xi Jinping. And I don't want to belabor this or get into it in any great detail, but it was at that moment that this form of leadership in China began to recatalyze the whole relationship of what went on within China and what went on between China and the world, between China and Singapore, and particularly between China and the United States. It transformed it. And we might want to talk in some way about what that transformation was about. The question I want to pose to all of you in closing is, how did a system that was working so well for China, so well for the world, so well for Asia, how did it end and why did it end? Whose interest was it? National interest to see engagement end. And yet, I'm sorry to tell you, you know it, I don't need to hear it from me, but it is irrevocably gone. It's over. It's dead. And we don't have a new system to replace it. And it seems to me that if in all of the years that I've been looking at China since the late 50s, first went in the mid-70s when Mao was still alive, to me, I look at it as an immense tragedy and an inexplicable tragedy brought about for reasons which I think you can explain some of it, but not rationally, because it isn't in anybody's interest that it end, and yet it did. So I'd just like to leave that question out there because I think it lies at the heart of the matter of what our session is about.
All right. Thank you, Professor Schell. Next, we have Professor Wang Jiangyu to give your opening remarks. We can come back to the discussion later. Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here and to be with two distinguished international relations and foreign policy scholars here. I'm an international lawyer, so it's a bit strange for me to be here, but I do have a bit of interest in international relations. And it's also a very, very touching event for me because I lived and worked in Singapore for 16 years, and Lee Kuan Yew was part of my life for the better part of those days. And almost every week we had his image and his voice, and we were inspired by him. And so I feel it was a huge shock for me, and I thought we are losing this man in 2016. That was truly a shocking moment. And I was actually thinking then, if Lee Kuan Yew was born and grew up in China, he could be one of the top 3 greatest leaders, including the emperors, in whole Chinese history. In whole Chinese, probably among the Tang Zhong Song Zhou, Qin Huang Han Wu, right? Very, very likely. So that's why I'm very happy to be here. And with all that, I will now switch to Chinese. I'm very glad I've been encouraged by the organizer to speak in Chinese, which I feel very comfortable to do. 谢谢，非常感谢邀请我。
Once again, I'm very honored to be invited to be part of this discussion. In response to our moderator's question, I would like to share with you from a perception. Perception is reality. That's what people say, tend to name it. Regarding this Sino-US relationship, especially when it comes to the conflicts, I think the major changes over the last 20 years mainly is the change with the perception of each other. And I would say this is probably one of the most terrifying changes. As we know that ever since People's Republic of China was founded, so there were 2 major conflicts. Mainly is the Korean Peninsula War, and another one is the China's embassy was bombarded by NATO. So these were the 2 major conflicts that could make people in China feel uncomfortable.
中美之间的这个
So that this hatred is it didn't quite prolong, but from my personal observation right now in terms of the long-term and sustained kind of situation, but this is not in a very positive way. We don't look at it in a positive manner. That is, from the historical point of view, if we were to review and recall, the change, the point where changes took place is probably, 2008, where the financial crisis happened. That was when, in the Chinese financial crisis, then back then to U.S. financial crisis, U.S. actually provided help to the Chinese, easing the whole crisis, and they also sustained and was able to help make big purchases, and it also helped in terms of the loans. So in terms of the conditions that were set out by the US, China went ahead to support and agree with the conditions that were set out. But on one hand, because now they are the lender, so the attitude from the lender, there's this kind of arrogance involved because of the position, the stand that they were having. So when it comes to the leaders, the Chinese leaders saying that, when you were leaders, but now that you have become our students, so you are no longer qualified to be our leader or our teacher, as a mentor. So this is a change in terms of the whole, when it all took place. That was the starting point of the change. And then 2015, it's another turning point. I personally think that when it came to the diplomacy, the report that was being released at that time, it actually, made some remarks towards China's Chinese situation. I think that really created a huge reaction. They were saying China as a competitor, in fact, a rival, an enemy, and that really sparked off the trade war. So for this, from the Chinese point of view, where we stand from the U.S. Understanding, and what Professor Orville have already said, many of his points I do agree and I empathize. But from Chinese point of view, for the rest of the time, I'm going to very quickly talk about 2 points in terms of Chinese point of view, understanding of U.S. And this, the whole understanding of what U.S. is, the America. In China, there is this collective ideology, the anti-U.S. kind of mindset and perspective. The whole emotion is really quite strong. We cannot just we can't make it very simple. We can't simplify it by saying that it's just an overall kind of emotive that is being across the board. We do have to give a lot of attention, pay attention to this whole collective kind of perspective and emotive that's towards the whole United States, aside from the government, but also towards the whole citizens, the general public in the United States. So what the general public is thinking, the understanding towards the United States is that they are the bullies, the way that they have actually gone ahead to put forth this trade war, and the way all the changes in the policies, the trade war and the sanctions against the Chinese companies and enterprises, there are no limits. There's no, limits to it. So that's what was being mentioned, the way, the rhetoric, the voice, the tone, even though you can talk about it, but the actions that followed were fairly aggressive. So there hasn't been any loosening in terms of the behavior and the actions that were taken against China. So from China's point of view, it hasn't been as friendly. So therefore, as things develop over time, the general public in China towards the United States, it's a growing kind of discontent and anger towards United States. This has got nothing to do with the leadership, the government. It's got nothing to do with the leadership. It didn't have that kind of effect. We were not seeing the same kind of effect. But from Chinese point of view, we are actually seeing what the Chinese think that in the United States, what they are trying to do, or all the actions that followed had ill intention. So the second point would be the understanding towards China. In China, is the lack of understanding in terms of the reflection of the actions within China. Within China, there's a lack of environment that will allow China to actually reflect on itself. What are the areas that we can improve upon? Are there any problems internally in terms of how we are actually approaching external parties, other countries, and regions? Are there areas that we can improve and reflect upon? For example, the South China Sea. what the world around China has actually beginning to see that, China is probably the way that they are handling South China Sea is trying to impose and show their presence in the South China Sea and the political environment. So the way that the hand, coming down, the actions that they have taken, they have used, is becoming a reality in terms of the people's observations around this kind of actions and political diplomacy actions. So I personally think in terms of the South China Sea, they can be fairly aggressive, but anything else, I don't think they are as aggressive as what everybody thinks. But within China, the mindset is that there's no need for reflection. There's no need to think and reflect upon it. To them, it's like, what others think of us? Actually, I personally think that we do need to have a time of looking back and to review what we are doing. And also within China, the domestic policies, what is internally, there's a scaling back in terms of our policy. The way that, and the reason why this is doing this, it could be the after comprehensive, a lot of deliberation before they roll out such a scaling back of what they are doing. It could be a personal experience from the leadership. It may not be as deeply or after much deliberation. It could also because of experience, or it could be moving towards the ideology. We are talking about politics, and it's about the rhetoric, about what is being discussed out there, in the public spheres, and also towards various enterprises, different sectors and industries. What are they actually doing that may be causing an impact on this kind of enterprises and businesses? So maybe from the leadership point of view, they do have a plan, a long-term plan, but we are not too clear at this point of time. But on the other side would be in terms of the international perspective. So this has actually strengthen the kind of perception of the outside world towards China. How the region and the leaders and other politicians are looking at China, the whole perspective. So therefore, right now, they are trying to ostracize, or in fact, let China stand alone. There isn't too much discussion in terms of this. So in terms within China, I personally think that it's very important to have a deeper understanding, greater understand for China's understanding towards the United States, and also for China within itself in the country, domestic point of view.
Opening remarks with us. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me here. So it's my big pleasure. I really enjoyed Dr. Schell and Professor Wang's the presentation. I want to make some complimentary comments. First of all, I see deterioration of China-U.S. relations is very structural in terms of international relations theory and historical exploration. The reason is very, very, very basic. So China become what? Become a peer competitor to the United States. So then the U.S. take China as the number one biggest competitor, strategic competitor. Americans' policy narrative, biggest strategic competitor is very definitely equal to biggest threat, biggest enemy. So then I think that kind of things is truly happening just because, as I mentioned, historically dramatic, power redistribution between the U.S. and China. Back to in 1979, China's GDP was less than 4% of Americans' won. But back to in 1999, Dr. Schell mentioned President Clinton's China visit, and both leaders just truly not just shake their hand, also re-energize our relations into the new high. So then Clinton administration agreed to sign what WTO, allowance of the China for entrance. So then Beijing also simultaneously get to developing countries some sort of a special treatment. So then finally, in 1999, both sides very successfully and eventually finally made the China's WTO entry agreement. It also marked some sort of a historical economic jumping of China. Since the reform opened up back to 1978, China's real economic, the great advancement just started from from what China's entering into the WTO back to in 1999. The US, Western countries opened the market for China's goods, China's productions. But back to the 1999, China's GDP just 10% of Americans won. We're still smaller and weaker. But last year, China's GDP accounts for 70% of Americans. So now I think there's no disagreements in the Americans' policy and strategic cycle. If this century there will be one power, which could just come up with the US and even overpass the US, only possibility is China. So then such a power redistribution, a power comparison is truly what? Truly recultivated Americans' China psyche and China's strategy as well. So therefore, then we'll see US completely change its China policy and strategy. But I think what is happening almost the same time is also a very dramatic China factor. So Xi Jinping administration, they are first generation of China leadership out of the baby boomer since the end of the Second World War. So that kind of the China leadership really witnessed the entire China's dramatic change. They consider China did a great job. Not just brought to China from some sort of a poverty country over to, some sort of, we say, 小康社会. It's a medially rich society. On the other hand, China also gets the biggest portion of the people out of the poverty. That kind of China's historical contribution. It should just reserve some sort of appraisal and appreciation. But the real contrasting reaction from the US is when the Americans' China strategy changed, US also launched the ideological attack to China. So demonization of the Chinese government and the Chinese internal and external relations and behavior also become a central piece of Americans' current China approach. Then it also triggered the Beijing's backfire. So then we will see China consider, we should raise up some sort of a new idea on how the international, the governance could just proceeding. So Beijing also repeatedly just set out some sort of a China idea from global security initiative to global civilization initiative. So then that's also reflection some sort of China's deepened frustration at the meantime, some sort of China's new enthusiasm in what? In standing up vis-a-vis United States. But second point I have to say, no matter how Chinese feel uncomfortable about Americans' dramatic change of China policy and strategy, but there's no way China could just falling into some sort of, fracture or even just a full, confrontation with U.S. On the one hand, China is still weak. U.S. still take a bigger lead in overall what? The national minds. So then Chinese traditional philosophy usually is very interesting. We don't prefer to just, fight with your bigger and stronger, the potential enemy. Otherwise, we will not just, have a big chance to win. So then that's why Beijing remain in low profile. We should get back to the Chinese traditional philosophy. I mean, we needed to know how to 以弱胜强, 以柔克刚. So from this point, I think yes, no matter how the China's domestic emotions vis-a-vis the US is getting poisonous and even confrontational, but the policy circle, we're still very, very, very expectably consistent. We refuse any military security diplomatic showdown with American counterpart. We should completely reject any, some sort of great power seduction of tumbling into what? Into some sort of, we say, overall confrontation. So even Taiwan issue, there's a lot of speculation. Probably it will become some sort of explosive points. To be honest, no, I don't think so. Final points. I think, yes, on the one hand, the US just take China as the biggest, strategic competitor. There's no way China can escape from. So therefore, we also have to reconfigure the China's policy and strategy. So I think Jiangyu also made a point. When great power just get into the re-emergence, it's not the glory, it's a risk at all. So Beijing should keep the mind sobering enough. Otherwise, any, we say, unmanageable conflict or confrontation with the US will be very disastrous for China's historical re-emergence. So China's diplomatic pragmatism remains very expected. I think it's also reflecting some sort of China's leading components of the strategic culture. So I also made 2 days ago, I think, China will not the Putinist Russia. China will not Stalinist Soviet Union. We should recognize how big the risk is when the US being completely about face to China. The most important thing is let's get the 1.4 billion Chinese people still have a better off in the coming decades. It's our only most important strategic target. I think the entire Chinese society should reformulate the consensus on. So from this point, I think, yes, on the one hand, from the Chinese government to the Chinese ordinary people, they are anti-Americans. Some sort of a sentiment now is just really, we say, raising up. But on the other hand, I hope the deterioration of our relationship is some sort of a sobering medicine and get China pay more attention to our diplomacy and the domestic economic strategy. So from this point, I really hope in today's world that when the global issues unbelievably just sweeping through every corner of the earth, probably there is only one choice, US and China competing, but we should sticking. On the one hand, we should also in some sort of with a conflict, but on the other hand, we should still keep the interdependence almost in all the corners and get the US-China relations moving forward in some sort of competitive but manageable manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhu. Well, I think our panelists are coming from rather different perspectives. Professor Orville focuses on the leadership that's under President Xi Jinping. And I think, Professor Wang, you mentioned about US containment efforts on China, and also there's Chinese lack of reflection on certain of its actions, and also the leadership's tightening of control. Whereas Professor Zhu Feng, you have talked about the containment efforts by the West, led by the US, reactions to a rising China. Would you like to respond to what the other panelists has just shared?
There's so many interesting questions here, I hardly know where to begin. But let me begin with the question of American containment of China. Let me also remind you that 9 American presidential administrations wholeheartedly supported engagement. And I think that it's a really interesting question that we might want to try to analyze a little, is the question I began with, why did it end? Because containment came out of the end of engagement. After engagement ended, then people began getting a little bit alarmed, a little bit threatened, a little bit, feeling somewhat fearful that you mentioned China becoming more assertive. Some people even describe it as belligerent. And I think it was that change which triggered the old impulse within America and now within Europe to some extent too for containment. But it wasn't something that just jumped up out of nowhere. It was something that was a response to China's own actions. At least that's how I view it. Now, that doesn't mean the United States is a perfect country and doesn't do anything wrong. That's not true. But I think that it's really important, if we're going to try to find a solution to this, to understand where the impulse to reassert a kind of containment policy comes from. Let me just ask you, too, another question. Was it necessary for China to completely antagonize Canada, Australia, India, Korea, Japan, and now maybe the Philippines? Why is that in China's interest? They weren't resisting China's rise. They didn't see China as a hostile power. They saw China, they were content to see China rise and to profit by that rise in trade. So I think these things need to be a little more critically analyzed. You can't just say, oh, well, both sides made mistakes. Of course, that's true. But you have to look at what's the animating impulse. What began this downward slide that we're all now trying to wrestle with and figure out how to remedy? What should America have done that it didn't do?
Sorry, Professor Schell, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I'd much rather hear my colleagues answer it, because my answers, I'm sick of my answers. I know my answers. I want to hear some new answers. So speak.
No, I can only respond with one question to both Professor Schell and Professor Zhu. So the perceived radical change in Chinese foreign policy, was it kind of a natural progressing roughly around 2012, or was it because leadership change? So leadership change in this regime determines everything. It's also a puzzle to me. Right? So the why there was such a sudden change in both actual in actions and also in international perception. And also very quick response to, I prefer that it was very personal, because look at the so the China-Australia debacle, right? So the very short trajectory of China-Australia relations. I think it was about 3 years ago. So China was very angry with Australia, and because of the AUKUS, and also because it was when China believed that Australia was wholeheartedly following the American policy to contain China. So using not very polite.
They asked for an investigation of the Wuhan virus. That's what triggered it.
Yeah, but the quite interesting. So Australia's position hasn't changed. So Australia still has the same position, but very recently China decided to improve its foreign relation with Australia. So it was also a puzzle to me. So Australia hasn't changed. Nobody would see that Australia would withdraw the request, or Australia would not follow the American, would withdraw from AUKUS. But China seems to have decided to soothe, right, to improve relations with Australia. So it's all. it's all top-down process. I don't think you can come up with a rational answer for that.
Well, that may be a truth worth pondering.
Professor Zhu Feng, you want
好
to
的，
respond?
这个我觉得
Professor came up with a very interesting question. I'm going to switch to Chinese to respond. I think by using Chinese, I'll be able to explain my points more precisely. As Professor just mentioned, in terms of China's relationship with Korea, Japan, we know that there's this so-called Wolf-Warrior diplomacy. So to a large degree, it reflects China's more stylish diplomacy, because we know that China now is the second biggest economy in the world. And the U.S. doesn't respect China, and also the U.S. is somehow sees the rise of China as a threat. So should China continue to hold back, doesn't respond just to accept whatever U.S. is doing, or China purposely, intentionally keeps a low profile? That's a question. So apparently our current leaders in China, himself is a very tough character. He's not going to just swallow it without any respondents. When it comes to diplomacy, it's very important for countries to engage in transparent, direct, open dialogues and communication. Therefore, I personally believe that we shouldn't draw the equal sign between the past the wolf approach to a current diplomatic approach. China is unlike previously. China is not going to allow U.S. to suppress and to express it. I mean, you can try to contain China, but China is not going to just keep silent, allow U.S. to do what it wants. So when move towards the future, we will have to understand this. We will, and both countries have to understand their each other's policies and their leaders' personalities. Both countries need to have a deeper understanding of each other, and we need to engage in a more balanced, the rational analysis. And like what Professor Orville Schell just mentioned, the U.S.-China diplomacy is not the same as what we saw previously during the Cold War or during the Soviet Union times, because previously during that period, there wasn't hardly any exchanges or interaction. The point during that period, it focused mainly on the containment, the military confrontation. Whereas nowadays, right now, the new policy, when people talked about the new Cold War, the essence, the core essence of the new Cold War basically is people talked about a digital war, market war, a war with the ideology. And as we know that now the U.S. is also engaged in this technology war with China. This is definitely against WTO's principle, which is to pursue the free and open market. I would not say that this is not a new form of a Cold War or this new form of a containment, because what U.S. is doing in terms of the, waging this technology war against China is actually an indication of a new type of a Cold War. Thank you, Professor Zhu, for your comments. Perhaps we can invite more of your response when we move on to the Q&A session.
Flashpoint in China-U.S. rivalry. Many China observers have also weighed in about a possible war in the Taiwan Strait and the circumstances under which such a confrontation will occur. I want to ask, what is your view about this? Do you believe the U.S. military will be directly involved on the battlefield? And what do you think is the best way to avoid this scenario? Do you think the current situation of maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, if it is actually sustainable?
Well, you want me to start?
Oh, yeah, sure.
This is
Professor Orville,
pretty
yes.
much at the heart of the matter. I would say the Taiwan Straits and your field, South China Sea, are critically important. You know, when President Nixon was talking with Chairman Mao, and they're trying to figure out what to do about Taiwan, you may recall what Mao said. He said, you know, what does it matter if it takes 100 years to solve Taiwan? Let's not let that get in the way. Then you may recall that when Deng Xiaoping went to the United States to normalize relations with the US, he stopped in Tokyo and he was asked about Taiwan. He said, let's leave it for smarter generations to come to solve that. Not Xi Jinping's version of it's going to be solved sooner rather than later, but let's just not worry about it now. Evolution may take care of it. There's a natural interest that will tie the two together, and we'll deal with it then. Now, what was wrong with that as a solution? I think the problem is that, you know, at one point, Ma Ying-jeou came here, met with Xi Jinping. That was a good move. That was Singapore at its best. And then the saber rattling started across the Taiwan Straits, and it did condition the attitude of the people on Taiwan to make it, and then Hong Kong got enveloped by China, and this transformed the political chemistry in Taiwan. You have to acknowledge that. People in Taiwan do not want to be part of the Chinese mainland. So you can't just say, oh, give it to China. One of the most august and confirmed principles of the United Nations Charter is self-determination. So, you know, again, it seemed to me we were on a good trajectory with Taiwan at one point. We were trading. Foxconn was there, hundreds of thousands of employees, Apple was there, it was all okay. It's when it began to be getting to say that we can't wait and that we have the right to militarily occupy and take Taiwan, that just scared everybody in Taiwan away from wanting to be part of the Chinese mainland and made the thing impossible. At least that's my view. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, it's an enormous tragedy because we were on the way to mending this thing. And we destroyed that hope. We destroyed that scenario. And I was recently in Taiwan. I started studying Chinese in Taiwan when I couldn't go to the mainland. I felt like I was back 50 years ago in the world in which I began trying to understand China and asking myself, why? And I haven't heard an answer yet.
Do you see a war erupting over the Taiwan Strait?
I'm very pessimistic because I think leaders with thin skin and 面子的问题, they get painted into corners where they have to act. It's very dangerous. And I fear that could be what happens with China and Xi Jinping. He feels that he's being humiliated. I mean, remember, China is a culture of grievance, of humiliation, and of anger against hostile foreign forces outside. And it could precipitate some very dangerous actions that could tip the world over in a heartbeat. I fear that. I'm not predicting it.
Right. Professor Wang?
Let's do first. I can't speculate whether the American military will get involved, but on Taiwan, I can make 3 quick points in Chinese. 就是第一呢
第一点 okay. First, I would say that Taiwan is the core essence of China's interests. Chinese government and the leadership has in many ways expressed their concern and their stand in order to ensure that Taiwan comes back to China, it literally to say that this is something that they're going to enforce. They're going to do that. Because to a certain country, there are certain things that they are not willing to let go of. Just like United States, they have made certain decisions in terms of making sure that certain things that is a basic requirement, they would go ahead to enforce and ensure that it is being done. Second point would be my personal observation. Just from observing, I don't feel that China has an immediate need to take back Taiwan. It may be military manner or in any other ways. There's no need for that. There's no requirement for that. I think one of the challenges would be how are they going to govern it? How are they going to do that? How are they going to govern the people once the return of Taiwan? How are you going to manage that to million people? The citizens, how are we going to manage them? We have to construct the government, the people, and the civil service. And Taiwanese, they have the habit of protesting. They have the it's become part of their lives that they can go onto the streets and make their voices heard. So even if it becomes one China one day, if Taiwan is constantly going on to the streets, making their voices heard, putting forth their views, it may not be something that China is comfortable and ready to accept that kind of culture. So I don't think in the near term this is going to happen. There's no conflict that will be happening. That's my personal point of view. The third point would be a very practical point of view, perspective, the very realistic point of view, the realist point. If you were to say that Taiwan is a chess, Taiwan is United States chess. Taiwan can also become a chess player for China, even though I don't have that immediate need to make into one China with Taiwan. But on the other hand, for China towards United States, the relationship right now is that we are fairly aligned. The Chinese people generally think that the United States government have ill intentions towards China. So, for United States to be, putting forth sanctions like chips, and all kinds of technology restrictions, then that's how the Chinese people are going to have grow the kind of perspective and perception towards the United States. So for the country, they do have that concern because of the Opium War, because of all the historical events that have happened. For the Chinese people generally have this kind of concern that they do not want any bullies to come in and to interfere with the China politics. So therefore, the people in China is very concerned with this. So the people itself do have this kind of worries. Yeah, so these are the 3 points that I would like to put forth. I would like to add on in terms of the Taiwan point. I think first point, which is critical, we need to know and we need to understand from President Trump to Biden, the United States policy has changed, have shifted, and the United States stance towards Taiwan has also shifted. So therefore, right now, this has become a very critical topic and something that we have to resolve because both, for China and Taiwan, the only one China is to recognize that there is only one Republic of China. How are we going to do that? If we are from Blinken and different leadership in the United States, for the United States, they are very clear. What is the problem with Taiwan? It is the United States, it's the Western countries and the Asian countries would like to, they want to protect the human rights, the rights of the Taiwanese. The problem with Taiwan has shifted no longer about the ground, who has rights to the country. It has shifted to human rights now, the rights of the people. So this has become the only play card that we have. So how are we going to support and continue this kind of conversation between both parties? So right now they are also trying to pull forth this kind of military placard. At the other side will be the complexity of this whole issue, the Taiwan Straits, the U.S., the Sino-China, in terms of the conflict, the potential conflict between both sides. There are many analysts who have put forth their voice. The tensions between China and Taiwan and the United States. That is, the United States are trying to have their point. They want to place their print in the South China Sea, just like the Silicon Crete. So this is something that the core, the essence of the whole conflict and the tension between all the countries. So this is a point that everyone is so concerned about chips development, technology, semiconductor, the trade between all these industries has become what everyone paying attention to. So the more tension there is between the United States and China, the more potential of going into a conflict with Taiwan would happen. So therefore, Taiwan has actually invested a lot in the United States in terms of of building plants, technology and manufacturing. So the tension and the stakes are a lot higher right now compared to the past years. So Taiwan issue is really very important and of critical importance. We shouldn't allow the United States to use Taiwan as one of the placards to play the diplomacy games. So especially with the Ukraine and Russia wars, about the conflict and all that. So there are so many things that's on the table to be considered.
That at some point a Chinese leader might say, first, Taiwan is ours. Everybody has agreed to that. Nobody is really disputing that. Second, as we develop, as we become more open, hopefully, as we become more comfortable, we will have discussions with Taiwan about the proper time and way to fold Taiwan into the larger Chinese proposition. Now, why isn't that a good way to go? What's the hurry? Here, I think, sadly, is where ideology enters. If China wants to be a one-party Leninist state and it expects Taiwan to accept that in Taiwan, I think it's going to be impossible. And I think we could have war. Yeah. If China were to say, and this was the virtue of reform, things are changing. And at one point we were at that moment where things were changing, and Taiwan was, hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese were going to the mainland to work. Happy, friendly. Companies were piling in, investment was piling in. Why did that end? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you two.
I think Prof. Schell is suggesting that on the U.S. side, you would think that Taiwan can wait and China can wait. And also, Prof. Wang also suggests that actually the Chinese are willing to wait, but now the Chinese are not trusting the U.S. enough, or not trusting the whole situation enough to wait, or so they are showing that.
Yeah. I can. This was already. I think you're right, Yian Ping. My own view is, my own observation is, I think China has never declared that it will take over Taiwan immediately or in the foreseeable future. But I fully agree with what Professor Jia Xingguo alluded to this morning. It depends on two things. Number one, what Taiwan does, right? So you have a group of people in Taiwan who are so desperate to pursue independence, right? Or either in the legal way or actual independence, de facto, de jure or de facto independence, and also it also depends on to what extent the U.S. treats Taiwan. So the Chinese belief now is the U.S. is using Taiwan as a card against China, right? So you are using Taiwan. So if without the U.S. behind it, Taiwan wouldn't be so assertive, right, in terms of pushing forward for independence. So this is the Chinese reading of the story. It might be misreading, but it may be true. But the American reading of China is going to take over Taiwan by 2027. That is also misreading. So you have misreadings here.
All right, so I think on Taiwan issue, we can just go on and on and on. Okay. Yeah. So we only have 15 minutes left, and we want to invite questions from the floor. So please tell us your name, where you are from, and who you are directing the question to. And try to keep your question short, and also just ask one question. You can supposed to also, ask the question online, but I think we'll just open to the floor. So if you raise your hands, and you can direct your question to. Yes, please. Ambassador Chan, yes. Can we have the mic, please? Thanks.
I'm not speaking as Ambassador Chan Orville. I'm speaking as a political scientist to a political scientist, and Professor Chia here is a political scientist, and I'm sure, Zhu Feng, you're a political scientist too. On your question, what happened? You were moving in engagement, and suddenly it changed. 9 presidents of the United States previously pursued a path of engagement. I think China was then a very different China. It was poor, it was backward, it was not a threat to the United States. The United States now is a very different United States also. You've changed a lot to today's United States. At one point, it seems to me that America suddenly woke up and saw that China had gained the military strength, critical military strength, and political power, technology power, economic power, to become your peer competitor. I think I heard there was somebody at Asia Society, I thought it was Steve Schwarzman, who thought the year was around 2017. Suddenly you felt it. And that was when America, awakened to the fact. It was also during President Trump's administration. So there was no going back after that. This is a peer competitor, and you've got to deal with it. Now, the question I have for you, and maybe the other speakers would also, Professor Wang and Professor Zhu, would like to comment too, is this. In the United States, you've said, why can't you get on? Is the United States only able to coexist with a non-communist regime, government? You cannot work with a communist government? So that's my question. I thought you could. You worked out some coexistence with the Soviet Union. So what is it different this time? And I come back to what has happened differently in the United States and what has happened differently in China today. You are polarized in the United States. People see things in extremes, So is there a nuanced view of China possible? I think America today overdraws China. China has made many mistakes, and China is not an angel. For Southeast Asians, we look at the South China Sea and we see problems, all right? So China is not an angel to us. But, nonetheless, many of us think the portrait the US has of China is overdrawn. Now, the question is whether China overdraws the image of America now. So, can you find a solution out of that? And the question, can America today live with a communist regime?
Well, I'll give you a quick answer, Hung Chi. I mean, that is the heart of the matter, isn't it, your question? I would say yes, because we did it for almost 3 decades. We lived relatively peacefully and tranquilly with a communist regime. I think what transformed the equation of our relations was not China's rise alone, which is unsettling and obviously causes some people concern. What really threw it off the tracks was the belligerence, the aggressiveness, the sort of challenging attitude, which I mean, many countries have now experienced around the world. And I think those two things were fatal. But China's rise alone, I think we were supporting that. Repeatedly said we did not see China's rise as a threat to our national well-being.
Professor Wang or Zhu Feng, do you want to also respond?
Go first.
好，谢谢陈大师，我觉得您这个问题。
Thank you, Ambassador, for your question. Indeed, it's a very good question. Why is it that the China-U.S. relationship not on good terms? As a so-called expert in this relationship, I have been following the U.S. for quite a number of years. Just a few days ago at the ASEAN dialogue, I have also mentioned that in 1978, China started its reform and opening up. The main reason why China has been doing so well with its economic development, U.S. is a very important positive factor, and that is something that we Chinese people cannot deny. As we know that, in Chinese, we believe that as a man of integrity, for the things that we need to be grateful, we definitely need to show our appreciation. In 70s, while I was studying, Professor Scholar Pino, Professor Tang Zhou, they came to Peking University as visiting scholars, and I had this honor to learn a lot of wonderful lessons in terms of international relations from these professors. My view is quite straightforward. For a great power, the relationship between the great powers is a constant struggle for power. So what U.S. is doing to China is quite normal. U.S. sees itself as a great power, and U.S. position itself to be one and only great power, and that is highly important for U.S. So that's the first question. That's the first point. Second point. With regards to the rise of China, the mainstream in U.S. is not prepared to accept a rising, strong China. That's why, yes, the ideology that U.S. has towards China remains consistent. They see China as a communist regime. And that is why in recent years, Chinese approach toward the U.S. has been going through some ups and downs in recent years. The fundamental reason is because this generation of a Chinese leadership, they feel quite good about themselves. They feel that they have done something, and they are not sure why U.S. is not able to give China the basic respect and understanding. So I think that's a fundamental question, Ambassador. You did raise a very important question in terms of the future relationship between China and the U.S. Definitely, this bilateral relationship has to take place in a manner of peace and be able to coexist in a peaceful manner. So both countries have to come to realize, have a proper perception of each other, and not to have this overdraw see each country. And next year, we understand that the presidential election is going to take place, and it's something that we are concerned, because whenever there's this major election taking place in U.S., China tends to be a topic or an issue for discussion on the table. And earlier on, one of the speakers touched on our Chinese people's anti-U.S. sentiment, or American people's anti-China sentiment. This is something that we have to manage properly.
Thank you. Paul Hanley from Carnegie China. I want to pick up where Ambassador Chan left the panel this morning with John Huntsman and Professor Jiaqing Guo, when she talked about the hope the region has that Xi Jinping and President Biden can meet at APEC in San Francisco and have a meeting there. I'm not clear whether that's going to happen or not. If I read the signals coming out of China, one Ministry of State Security social media site said that they're not satisfied with the U.S. approach, which is containment and engagement, old wine in a new bottle, and that the U.S. side would need to show sincerity in order for President Xi to be able to travel. So I'd like to try to understand better what that means, to show sincerity, in what form. Orville, the U.S. has as many grievances, I suspect, as China has in terms of the relationship. Does the U.S. need China to show that it's sincere for the meeting to happen? And if so, in what form? And then if we can make the meeting happen, what would be success from the Chinese side? We have to be realistic, I think. It's not going to change the general trajectory of the intensifying competition and antagonism in the relationship. But we should be able to do some good things. So from the Chinese standpoint, what would a good outcome be? And from a U.S. perspective, what would a good outcome be?
You know, Paul, one of my worries about this, I went to the last APEC meeting that was held in America in Seattle with President Clinton, and there were huge demonstrations in the street, even against Jiang Zemin. I worry that if President Xi does come to San Francisco, he will take umbrage at the free expression, which certainly is going to fill the streets of San Francisco. Now, that aside, do I think it's worth meeting? Yes, I do. I think it's always, diplomacy is the only other tool we have. The question is, what could Biden and Xi each give by way of sort of constituting a new form of a relationship? I'm not sure it's very clear.
Very quickly, first to Professor Chan's question, as a person who grew up in China and lived in the U.S. for a number of years, it gets frustrated and angry every day because I do have a habit of reading both Chinese and American newspapers. And reading the Chinese newspaper, you see how stupid those nationalist comments. And reading American newspaper, you see how hypocritical it is. How hypocritical and how biased it is. You got really every day very frustrated. So that's solid evidence that both countries are overdrawing each other, demonizing each other, and this is what worries me the most. And very quickly to Hanley, the question. There are two explanations. One is personal. That is, after all, it is one man's decision, because nobody knew why President Xi didn't go to the G20. Right? There are no explanation, and a number of other occasions. So it is a personal. It's totally up to one person, and when it comes to one person's decision, you can never predict. And the second explanation is what Professor Schell was alluded to. The Chinese perspective, or one Chinese perspective, might be it's meaningless to have meeting between the two leaders because the Chinese understanding is the United States didn't deliver anything right after the Bali conference, so nothing has been fulfilled. Why would we want to see each other again? Right? So you might have reasons for domestic political purpose, right, to control the conflict, but we don't have such a need. Right? We don't have such a need, so it makes no sense to meet you. So both are my guess. Right? Nobody knows.
Prof. Zhu?
好的，我觉得是。
I think in November, U.S. is going to host an APEC meeting. And this will be considered the second time offline state leaders conference. I think the possibility is still quite high, because we know that offline meetings have started to resume. And how are we able to push this mechanism to move forward? That is still hard to say. Recently, we see that now there's an option for both countries to maintain this stable relationship, we observe that there is one important factor, which is the exchange of visit between the state between the state leaders. We know that ever since the June 4th event, the reason why China and the U.S. were able to overcome a lot of obstacles, that's mainly that is attributed to the exchange of visit between the state leaders. So no doubt that this China-U.S. relationship is very complicated, but we have to go back to our history, which is very important to see that the state leaders are able to engage in these dialogues and the conversations. I think this will be critical in rejuvenizing this bilateral relationship. So that's my first point. Secondly, currently, this dialogue mechanism, how are we going to bring it forward? We see that both countries have to deal with their own domestic complication.
So there's a common point between both countries. It's not just their concern about their foreign diplomacy, but today, right around, is something that is critical, very pressing. That is, in terms of the emotions, right now, the emotions between both countries. So in terms of the state leaders, they play a very important role, and we should allow them to have the space to play their role in terms of, bringing together the relationship between both parties, both countries. They play a very critical role, so it cannot be replaced. What are going to be the impact that they're going to do? So I'm looking forward to the APEC, the summit that's going to be happening in November. And I'm really looking forward to what can come out of it.
The end of our Q&A session, even though we only have 2 questions from the floor. Could we have our panelists round off this session, please? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about U.S.-China relations?
Neither optimistic nor pessimistic. So we should have a very normally and reasonable expectation for bilateral relations. No illusion for the moment, no, we say, some sort of unrealistic, expectation at all. But we still need enthusiasm and even strategic convictions, because U.S.-China-U.S. relations absolutely most important and most complicated relations in the world.
我觉得你说得很对。
I think you said really well. I think it's really right of what you said. I agree fully.
China and Xi Jinping really were smart. They would recognize that Biden does want to make a deal. He is the best flight out. Get on board, because you know what's coming after him? We don't know. And it might be a lot worse. This is a guy who knows Xi Jinping better than any world leader because they spend more time together. My God, if they can't sit down and say, listen, the world is at a critical point here. It's in your interest, it's in my interest, it's in the world's interest to settle something. If they can't do that, well, I guess I'm just going to be pessimistic.
Great, I agree.
Yeah. A politically correct answer is I'm optimistic, and the honest answer is I don't know. It really depends on what these 2 countries do in the future, especially in the next 10 years, because history is often made by accidents, not necessarily by choice. So it really depends on what happens.
Well, thank you, panelists. I think you have been wonderful, and we surely want to remain hopeful. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.